Between December 1st, 1957, and January 29th, 1958, 11 people lay dead across Nebraska and Wyoming. The victims ranged from a 2-year-old child to a 70-year-old man, killed in their homes, on rural roads, in moments that transformed ordinary American life into scenes of inexplicable violence. The method, shootings, stabbings, bludgeoning, whatever weapons were available when rage or convenience demanded death. The perpetrators, Charles Raymond Starkweather, a 19-year-old garbage collector from Lincoln, Nebraska, and his 14-year-old girlfriend, Caril Ann Fugate, who either participated willingly in the murders or was held hostage throughout the spree, depending on whose account you believe. Law enforcement would eventually classify it as one of America's first recognized spree killings, a random murder rampage that shocked 1950s America and shattered the decade's myth of suburban safety and teenage innocence. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't political ideology or criminal profit or even clear mental illness. It was a teenage boy's rage at a world that had given him nothing, not respect, not success, not even basic human dignity, and a girl young enough to be caught between love and terror, between complicity and victimhood. And 11 families learned that in late 1950s America, when an angry young man decided the world owed him something and took a teenage girl along for the ride, nobody was safe. Not in their homes, not on the highway, not anywhere in the vast landscape between Lincoln and the Wyoming border, where 2 teenagers left a trail of bodies that would inspire decades of films, books, and the terrible recognition that mass murder could be motiveless, random, and as American as the open road. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that exposed the darkness beneath 1950s American prosperity and revealed how easily teenage alienation could metastasize into murder when combined with access to weapons, a car, and the vast empty spaces where victims could be killed without witnesses. Nebraska in 1957 was the American heartland in every sense. Agricultural economy, small towns connected by 2-lane highways running straight across flat prairie, population of about 1.4 million spread across 77,000 square miles, where distance was measured not in miles, but in hours of driving past cornfields and cattle ranches and grain elevators rising against endless sky. The state capital, Lincoln, had a population around 120,000, a college town built around the University of Nebraska, with a downtown of brick buildings, residential neighborhoods of small single-family homes, and an economy based on insurance, government, and agriculture-related businesses. December 1957 was the beginning of a brutal Nebraska winter. By early December, temperatures had dropped to the teens during the day, below zero at night, with wind that came across the open prairie with nothing to slow it down, cutting through clothes and making any time outside dangerous if you weren't prepared. The landscape was brown and dead, crops harvested months earlier, the ground frozen solid, snow coming in occasional storms that left a few inches of white, covering everything before wind blew it into drifts along fence lines and in ditches. The cold gave Nebraska a particular quality in winter, isolated, everyone staying inside, homes heated by furnaces burning natural gas or coal, windows frosted over, streets empty after dark because nobody wanted to be outside unless necessary. In rural areas, farms were separated by miles, with no neighbors visible, just the glow of distant farmhouse lights across dark fields at night. This isolation meant safety for most people. Crime was rare in 1950s Nebraska, and what crime existed was mostly property theft or drunken fights, not the kind of violence that required locking doors or worrying about strangers. But December 1957 wasn't just another Nebraska winter. The state and the entire country was in a moment of cultural tension beneath the surface prosperity of the 1950s. The post-World War II economic boom had created unprecedented wealth. Suburbs were expanding, consumer culture was thriving, television was bringing the world into living rooms, and America presented itself as a society where hard work guaranteed success and where family values maintained social order. The reality was more complicated. Juvenile delinquency was rising. Teenagers were forming gangs, getting into trouble, rejecting their parents' values in ways that terrified adults who remembered the Depression and the war, and who believed their children should be grateful for the prosperity they'd inherited. The teenagers saw it differently. They'd inherited a world of conformity, of suffocating expectations, of being told to be grateful for opportunities that felt hollow and meaningless when you didn't fit the mold of what success was supposed to look like. Charles Starkweather was one of those teenagers who didn't fit, and by December 1957, his alienation and rage were about to explode into violence that would shock America and expose the darkness that existed beneath the decades' carefully maintained image of innocence and order. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska, the third of 7 children in a working-class family that struggled financially throughout the Depression and its aftermath. His father, Guy Starkweather, worked as a carpenter when work was available, which often wasn't. His mother, Helen, took in laundry and did house cleaning for wealthier families, working constantly to keep 7 children fed and housed in a small house on the poor side of Lincoln, where dignity was hard to maintain when you wore secondhand clothes and ate commodity cheese. Charles grew up short. He'd reach only 5'5" as an adult, with a stocky, muscular build that came from physical labor and genetics rather than exercise. His most distinctive feature was his eyes, slightly crossed due to a condition called strabismus that his family couldn't afford to correct, which made him look perpetually confused or angry, and which made him a target for relentless bullying throughout childhood. Kids called him Little Red because of his reddish hair, or they mimicked his cross-eyed appearance, or they just beat him up because he was small and different, and because that's what kids did in working-class neighborhoods where displaying weakness meant being victimized. What Charles valued most was respect, not love. His family provided that, even if money was tight. Not success in conventional terms. He'd already understood by middle school that he wasn't going to college, wasn't going to escape Lincoln, wasn't going to become anything that society valued. What he craved was respect, to be seen as someone who mattered, who commanded fear if he couldn't command admiration, who wasn't just another poor kid from the wrong neighborhood getting through life on society's margins. Charles developed a persona built around emulating James Dean, the actor who died in a car crash in 1955 and who'd become a symbol of teenage rebellion and masculine coolness. Charles styled his hair like Dean, wore jeans and leather jacket like Dean, cultivated a sullen, dangerous image that said he didn't care what anyone thought. But underneath the pose was desperate insecurity, a boy who'd been bullied so relentlessly that his entire identity became about proving he was tough, that he wasn't weak, that people should fear him rather than mock him. By age 16, Charles had dropped out of high school. He'd never been a good student, had struggled with reading due to undiagnosed dyslexia, and saw no point in continuing when teachers viewed him as a discipline problem, and when he knew he'd end up in manual labor regardless of education. He worked a series of jobs, warehouse work, construction, and by early 1957, as a garbage collector for the Lincoln City Sanitation Department. The job paid minimum wage, was physically demanding, and carried the social stigma of being the garbage man, which reinforced Charles's sense that society had marked him as trash, as someone who'd never be more than Lincoln's working-class underclass. In 1956, when Charles was 17, he met a girl who would become the most important person in his life, and eventually the companion on his murder spree. Caril Ann Fugate was born on July 30th, 1943, making her 14 years old, when she met Charles Starkweather in late 1956. She was a student at Whittier Junior High School in Lincoln, a pretty girl, dark hair, delicate features, the kind of early blooming attractiveness that made her popular with boys and envied by other girls. She came from a working-class background similar to Charles's. Her mother, Velda Bartlett, worked as a waitress. Her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, was a sign painter, and the family lived in a small house on Belmont Avenue in a neighborhood that wasn't quite respectable, but wasn't quite slum either. Caril was young for her age in some ways, still playing with dolls, still interested in typical teenage things like movies and popular music, but old enough to be flattered when an older boy paid attention to her. Charles was 18 when they started dating, 5 years older, which wasn't unusual in 1950s working-class culture, where age gaps in teenage relationships were common and rarely questioned. But the relationship was intense in ways that worried Caril's parents. Charles was possessive, jealous, demanded all of Caril's time and attention, and had a reputation as trouble, someone who'd been in fights, who'd been fired from jobs for arguing with supervisors, who seemed angry at the world in ways that suggested instability. Velda and Marion Bartlett didn't approve of the relationship. They thought Charles was too old for their 13-year-old daughter when they'd started dating, too rough, too poor, and too likely to drag Caril into trouble. They'd tried to break up the relationship several times, forbidding Caril from seeing him, but teenage prohibition rarely works. It just makes the forbidden relationship more appealing, more romantic, more proof that the world doesn't understand true love. By late 1957, the relationship between Caril and her parents had deteriorated significantly. She spent most of her free time with Charles, lying about where she was going, sneaking out to meet him, defending him against her parents' criticisms. She was 14, in love with a 19-year-old boy who treated her like an adult, who made her feel special and important in ways that her working-class life in Lincoln didn't provide. What Caril didn't understand, what nobody could have understood until it was too late, was that Charles's intensity wasn't romantic devotion. It was obsession born from someone who'd been rejected and mocked his entire life, and who'd found one person who accepted him, who he clung to with desperation that would eventually turn violent when the world tried to take her away. By December 1957, Charles was living on the edge. He'd been fired from his garbage collection job in November for chronic lateness and arguing with his supervisor. He had no money, no prospects, no future that looked any better than his present. He spent his days in his parents' house, sleeping late, watching television, occasionally working day labor when he needed cash for gas or cigarettes. He spent his evenings with Caril when she could sneak away from her parents' supervision. On November 30th, 1957, Charles made a decision that would set everything in motion. He bought a .22 caliber rifle, paying $39 at a hardware store, no background check required because this was 1957 America, where guns were tools you bought as easily as hammers. Charles told people he wanted it for hunting, but hunting season was mostly over, and everyone who knew him understood that Charles buying a gun probably meant trouble, though nobody imagined how much trouble or how many people would die because of it. The first murder occurred on December 1st, 1957, at a gas station on the outskirts of Lincoln. The victim was Robert Colvert, 21 years old, a service station attendant working the evening shift at the Crest service station on Cornhusker Highway. Robert was recently married, had a baby daughter, worked 2 jobs to support his young family, and had no connection to Charles Starkweather beyond being the person unlucky enough to be working alone at a gas station when Charles decided he needed money. Charles arrived at the station around 10:30 p.m., driving his father's 1949 Ford, carrying his newly purchased rifle. His plan was simple: rob the station, take whatever cash was there, maybe $50 or $100, enough to take Caril on a date or buy Christmas presents, or feel like he had something instead of nothing. He wore a bandana over his face, like a Western outlaw, which would have been almost comical if the rifle wasn't real and loaded. Robert was inside the station's office, probably reading a magazine or listening to the radio, standard activities for night shift workers at rural gas stations where customers were infrequent after dark. Charles entered, pointed the rifle at Robert, and demanded money. Robert complied, opened the cash register, pulled out approximately $100. Not a fortune, but more cash than Charles typically had at once. What happened next would be disputed by Charles in various accounts he'd give over the years, changing the story to make himself look less culpable or more justified, or simply to tell whatever version he thought people wanted to hear. But the basic facts were undisputed. Charles forced Robert at gunpoint to drive with him out of Lincoln, heading north on Highway 77 toward the town of Bennett, about 15 miles away. The roads were dark, empty, frozen, the kind of isolated rural highway where you could drive for 20 minutes without seeing another vehicle. Charles later claimed Robert had tried to fight back, had grabbed for the rifle, that the shooting was self-defense or accidental. But forensic evidence told a different story. Robert was shot once in the head, execution style, at close range while sitting in the passenger seat of Charles's car. The bullet entered behind his right ear, traveled through his brain, and killed him instantly. Charles then drove another mile, dragged Robert's body from the car, dumped it in a roadside ditch, and drove back to Lincoln, $108 richer, and having crossed a line that he could never uncross. The murder was discovered the next morning, December 2nd, when Robert's body was found by a farmer checking his fence line. Lincoln police investigated, identified the victim, determined this was an armed robbery gone wrong, but they had no leads, no witnesses, no reason to connect this murder to Charles Starkweather, a 19-year-old nobody from Lincoln's wrong side of town. The investigation went nowhere, classified as an unsolved homicide, filed away while detectives waited for evidence that wouldn't arrive for nearly 2 months. Charles told no one about the murder. Not his family, not his friends, not even Caril. He spent Robert Colvert's money on small things: gas, cigarettes, a movie, cheap gifts. The murder changed him, though people who knew him couldn't identify exactly how. He seemed more confident, more dangerous, more willing to talk about violence and death in ways that suggested he'd crossed some psychological threshold where those things no longer felt theoretical or forbidden. For 8 weeks, Charles went back to his ordinary life. He looked for work, spent time with Caril, hung around Lincoln doing nothing productive, just another working-class teenager without prospects or future. But he'd killed someone, and having done it once, having discovered that killing was easier than he'd imagined and that consequences weren't immediate, the psychological barrier that prevents most people from murder had been shattered. The next time, and there would be a next time, would be easier. On January 21st, 1958, Charles went to Caril's house on Belmont Avenue, intending to see his girlfriend, possibly to argue with her parents, who'd been increasingly vocal about wanting Caril to end the relationship. Exactly what happened next would be disputed for decades, with two radically different versions emerging: Charles's account, which portrayed Caril as a willing participant in the murders, and Caril's account, which portrayed her as a hostage who was forced to cooperate under threat of death. According to Charles's later testimony, he arrived at the Bartlett house around 1 p.m. Caril's mother, Velda, was home, as was her stepfather, Marion, and her 2-year-old half-sister, Betty Jean. Charles got into an argument with Velda and Marion about his relationship with Caril. Voices were raised, and when Marion told Charles to leave and never come back, Charles pulled out a .22 caliber rifle he'd brought with him and shot Marion in the head. Velda screamed, ran toward the bedroom, and Charles shot her in the back. She fell, not dead yet, trying to crawl away. Charles walked over to where she'd fallen and shot her again in the head, killing her. Betty Jean, the 2-year-old, was in another room, started crying when she heard the gunshots. Charles went into that room and either struck her repeatedly with the rifle butt or strangled her. Accounts vary, killing a toddler who was crying for her mother. 3 people dead in maybe 3 minutes. Charles then cleaned up the blood as best he could, dragged the bodies to various parts of the house. Marion's body was stuffed in a chicken coop behind the house. Velda's body was placed in the basement. Betty Jean's small body was put in a cardboard box in the basement next to her mother. Then Charles waited for Caril to come home from school. Caril arrived around 3:30 p.m., walked into her house to find Charles there, the house eerily quiet, her family missing. Charles told her what he'd done. According to Charles, Caril was shocked initially, but then accepted it, helped him clean up remaining blood, helped him maintain the pretense that everything was normal. According to Caril, Charles held a knife to her throat, told her he'd kill her if she didn't cooperate, forced her to help him create the appearance that nothing was wrong so that nobody would investigate for as long as possible. For 6 days, from January 21st through January 27th, Charles and Caril stayed in the Bartlett house with 3 bodies hidden in various locations. They put a sign on the front door that read, "Stay away, everybody is sick with the flu." Sick, misspellings and all, to discourage visitors. Family members and friends came by, saw the sign, called out and got responses from Caril, either willingly giving false assurances or forced by Charles to say everything was fine, and left, assuming the family had the flu and didn't want visitors. The authorities would later marvel at how long the deception worked. For 6 days, nobody investigated seriously enough to discover that 3 people were dead, and that a teenage girl was either hostage or accomplice to murder. Caril's school called about her absences, but accepted the explanation that she was homesick. Neighbors noticed Charles's car parked at the house for days, but assumed he was helping care for the sick family. On January 27th, Caril's grandmother and uncle, worried because they hadn't been able to reach the family, came to the house and insisted on checking that everyone was okay. Charles, realizing the deception couldn't hold much longer, left with Caril, taking his rifle and what money and supplies they could gather. They drove away in Charles's car, leaving the 3 bodies to be discovered by Caril's relatives, who entered the house, found the carnage, and called police. By the time Lincoln police arrived at the Bartlett house on January 27th, around 4:00 p.m., and discovered 3 murder victims, Charles and Caril had a several-hour head start. They were driving north out of Lincoln, armed, desperate, and about to begin a murder spree that would kill 8 more people in the next 2 days. After fleeing the Bartlett house on January 27th, Charles and Caril drove northeast from Lincoln, heading toward the small farming community of Bennett. Charles needed a place to hide, needed supplies, and decided to target a farm owned by August Meyer, 70 years old, a family friend who'd sometimes hired Charles for odd jobs and who lived alone on an isolated property about 5 miles from Bennett. They arrived at Myers' farm around 5:30 p.m., just after dark, on a freezing January evening. Meyer was home, welcomed Charles, probably confused why the young man was showing up unannounced with a teenage girl, but Midwestern hospitality
meant you invited people in out of the cold and asked questions later. Charles shot August Meyer in the head while the old man was turned away, probably making coffee or preparing to offer his visitors food. The shooting was execution style, close range, no warning. Meyer died instantly, 70 years old, killed by someone he'd shown kindness to, murdered because Charles needed his property as a hideout and his car to replace the vehicle that was now associated with the Bartlett murders. Charles and Caril tried to start Meyer's car, but found it wouldn't run. The cold and lack of use had killed the battery. They were trapped at the farm with a dead body, with no working vehicle, with police now searching for them after the Bartlett bodies had been discovered. They spent the night at Meyer's farm, sleeping in the dead man's house, eating his food, waiting for morning when they'd figure out what to do next. The Jensen King murders. On the morning of January 28th, Charles and Caril left Meyer's farm on foot, walking along the rural road, freezing, desperate for a vehicle. Around 11 a.m., 2 teenagers drove past, Robert Jensen, 17, and Caril King, 16, from the nearby town of Bennett, who were driving around the countryside in Robert's 1950 Ford, probably talking, listening to the radio, doing what teenagers in rural Nebraska did when they wanted time together away from parents. Charles flagged them down, pretending his car had broken down, asking for help. Robert, being a decent Midwestern kid raised to help people in need, stopped. Charles pulled his rifle, forced both teenagers out of the car, made them lie face down on the frozen ground beside the road. What happened next depends on whose account you believe. Charles later claimed Robert tried to fight back, that the shooting was necessary to maintain control. But forensic evidence showed that Robert was shot 6 times, twice in the back of the head at point-blank range, then 4 more times in his back and torso as he lay on the ground, already dead or dying. This wasn't defensive shooting. This was execution, methodical and complete. Caril King's murder was even more brutal. She'd been forced into an abandoned storm cellar near where the car had stopped. She was sexually assaulted. Forensic evidence was unclear about whether penetration had occurred, but her clothing was torn and disturbed in ways that indicated sexual violence. Then she was stabbed repeatedly, at least 10 times according to the medical examiner, in her chest, abdomen, and back. Her body showed defensive wounds on her hands where she'd tried to fight off the knife. She'd been 16 years old, a high school student, killed because she'd been driving with her boyfriend on a rural road when a murderer needed their car. Charles and Caril took Jensen's Ford, left the bodies where they'd fallen, and drove west, heading toward Wyoming, leaving Nebraska behind. 2 more deaths, bringing the total to 8 people killed in just over a month, with the violence accelerating, the murders becoming more brutal, the geographic scope expanding as the spree moved across state lines. By late afternoon on January 28th, Charles and Caril had crossed into Wyoming, driving on Highway 20 toward Casper. The Jensen Ford was running low on gas, they had no money, and they were driving a stolen vehicle that would be reported as soon as Jensen's and King's bodies were discovered. They needed a place to hide, needed supplies, and Charles had decided that simply stealing wasn't sufficient. He had to eliminate witnesses, had to kill anyone who saw them, because letting people live meant risk of identification and capture. Around 7 p.m., they approached the home of C. Lauer Ward, a wealthy businessman,
and his wife Clara, 51 and 50 years old, respectively, who lived in a large house on the outskirts of Douglas, Wyoming. The Wards were successful, respectable, had lived in Wyoming their entire lives, represented everything that Charles had never been and never would be. Wealthy, established, secure. Charles later said he'd chosen their house because it looked expensive, because he resented what they represented, because killing rich people felt more justified than killing working-class people like himself. Charles and Caril approached the house around 7:30 p.m., knocked on the door, and when Clara Ward answered, Charles forced his way inside at gunpoint. Lauer Ward was in his study, came out to see what was happening, and Charles shot him immediately, one bullet to the chest, killing him quickly but not instantly. Clara screamed, tried to run, and Charles chased her through the house, shooting her multiple times, once in the back, once in the neck, finally once in the head as she fell. The Ward murders were the most gratuitous of the spree because Charles and Caril then stayed in the house for hours, ate the Ward's food, stole Clara Ward's jewelry and Lauer Ward's wallet, slept in their bed while the bodies cooled in other rooms. Charles tried on Lauer Ward's clothes, took some that fit, left wearing a dead man's coat and boots. In the morning, they loaded up the Ward's Packard with food, supplies, and valuables, and drove away, continuing west, apparently heading toward Washington State, though Charles later claimed he had no real destination in mind, just an idea that he'd eventually reach the West Coast and figure something out. This was the 10th and 11th murders, 11 people dead in under 2 months, but the spree was accelerating. 6 of those murders had occurred in just the past 48 hours. Charles was no longer killing out of panic or necessity. He was killing because he could, because the psychological barriers had completely collapsed, because each murder made the next one easier until killing became a default response to any situation that required a solution. The manhunt for Charles Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate had become a massive operation by January 29th, involving police from multiple states, the FBI, and widespread media coverage that made them the most wanted fugitives in America. Their descriptions had been broadcast on radio and television, their photographs published in newspapers across the country, and law enforcement had established roadblocks on major highways throughout Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, and surrounding states. On the morning of January 29th, Charles and Caril were driving west on Highway 20 in Wyoming, approximately 30 miles outside of Douglas, in the stolen Packard that had belonged to the Wards. A Wyoming Highway Patrol officer named William Romer was conducting routine patrol when he spotted the Packard matching the description from police bulletins. Romer followed at a distance, radioed for backup, then attempted to pull the vehicle over. Charles saw the patrol car, panicked, and accelerated, beginning a high-speed chase that would reach speeds of over 100 miles per hour on the 2-lane highway. Caril was crying, begging Charles to stop, saying they should surrender. Charles refused, said they'd never take him alive, said he'd rather die in a shootout than spend life in prison. He had his rifle on the seat beside him, was driving with one hand, reaching for the weapon with the other. Deputy Sheriff Earl Heflin, responding to Romer's call for backup, joined the chase from a side road, positioning his vehicle to cut off the Packard. Charles saw the roadblock forming ahead, tried to swerve around it, but the Packard left the road, hit a ditch, and came to a stop, stuck in the frozen ground. Charles grabbed his rifle, jumped from the car, and started running across an open field, firing shots back at the pursuing officers. Officer Romer fired once, hitting Charles in the leg, dropping him. Charles fell, tried to crawl, and was surrounded within seconds by officers with weapons drawn. The chase was over. The spree had ended not with a dramatic shootout, But with a teenage murderer lying in frozen Wyoming dirt with a bullet in his leg, crying, saying they shot me, with genuine surprise that violence could be inflicted on him after he'd inflicted it on so many others. Caril was still in the car, uninjured, hysterical, screaming. When officers reached her, she immediately said she'd been kidnapped, that Charles had killed her family, that she'd been held hostage for 8 days, that she'd had no choice but to go along with him because he'd threatened to kill her. Officers weren't sure whether to believe her. She'd been seen laughing with Charles at various points during the spree, had helped him dispose of evidence, had allegedly participated in some of the murders according to witnesses who'd seen them together. But she was 14 years old, small, terrified, and claiming victimhood. The question of her culpability would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Charles Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate were transported back to Nebraska to face murder charges. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the killing spree. 11 victims across 2 states in less than 2 months, ranging from a 2-year-old child to a 70-year-old man, killed in their homes, on highways, in moment of casual violence that suggested the perpetrators had lost all connection to normal human empathy. The media coverage was unprecedented. This was 1958, the beginning of television's dominance in American media, and the Starkweather case became one of the first major crimes to receive national TV coverage. Reporters descended on Lincoln, on the crime scenes, on the towns where victims had lived. The story had everything that made for compelling media. Young, attractive defendants, seemingly random victims, a cross-country rampage, a teenage girl who might be either accomplice or victim, and the shocking realization that America's heartland, safe, wholesome Nebraska, could produce someone like Charles Starkweather. The coverage created the template for how American media would cover spree killings for decades to come. Focus on the killer's background, poor, troubled, bullied, on the relationship dynamics, young love or toxic control, on the victims, innocent, ordinary people, and on the existential question of how this could happen in wholesome America. The coverage also made Charles briefly famous, which he clearly enjoyed. He gave multiple interviews from jail, always trying to control his image, sometimes portraying himself as a rebel hero like James Dean, sometimes as a victim of society, sometimes as genuinely remorseful, though his remorse seemed performative rather than authentic. The investigation established the timeline and the facts of each murder. Robert Calvert, December 1st, 1957. Shot during robbery. Body dumped in ditch. Marion Bartlett, January 21st, 1958. Shot in head at home. Velda Bartlett, January 21st, 1958. Shot multiple times at home. Betty Jean Bartlett, January 21st, 1958. Beaten, strangled, age 2. August Meyer, January 27th, 1958. Shot in head at his farm. Robert Jensen, January 28th, 1958. Shot 6 times, execution style Carole King. January 28th, 1958, sexually assaulted and stabbed 10+ times. C. Lauer Ward, January 28th, 1958, shot at home in Wyoming. Clara Ward, January 28th, 1958, shot multiple times at home. Merle Collison, January 29th, 1958, shot 9 times in his car. Victim I hadn't mentioned earlier, Charles had killed a traveling salesman that morning before his capture. 11 victims, 9 adults, 2 children, all killed within 59 days. The geographic spread, Lincoln, rural Nebraska, Wyoming, and the variety of victims, rich and poor, urban and rural, families and strangers, made clear this wasn't a targeted killing spree. It was random violence, killing for the sake of killing, murder as response to any situation where Charles felt challenged or needed something or simply wanted to exercise the power he'd never had in ordinary life. Charles Starkweather was tried first, beginning in May 1958, just 4 months after his capture. The trial took place in Lancaster County District Court in Lincoln, presided over by Judge Harry Spencer. Charles was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Robert Jensen. Prosecutors chose this case because it was one of the clearest. No possible claim of self-defense or accident, just execution-style murder of a teenager who'd stopped to help. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Ballistics matching Charles's rifle to bullets found in Jensen's body. Witnesses who'd seen Charles and Caril in Jensen's stolen car. Charles's own confessions, which he'd given freely to police, to journalists, to anyone who'd listen, apparently proud of what he'd done, or at least unable to stop talking about it. Charles's defense was incoherent. His lawyers initially tried to argue insanity, claiming Charles was mentally ill and couldn't distinguish right from wrong. But Charles undermined this defense by giving interviews where he described the murders in detail, explained his reasoning, showed clear understanding that killing was wrong, but claiming he'd had no choice, or that victims had deserved it, or that society had driven him to it. The insanity defense collapsed when psychiatrists testified that Charles was a psychopath, someone with no empathy or conscience. But that psychopathy wasn't the same as legal insanity. He knew what he was doing. He just didn't care. The jury deliberated for 24 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The sentencing phase took one additional day. On May 23, 1958, Judge Spencer sentenced Charles Starkweather to death in the electric chair. Charles showed no emotion, later told reporters he'd expected the death sentence, said he accepted it, though he also said he believed he'd been treated unfairly, that society had created him through years of poverty and bullying, and that if the world had given him opportunities, he wouldn't have become a killer. Caril Ann Fugate's trial was more complicated. She was charged as an adult despite being only 14 years old at the time of the murders, charged with first-degree murder in the death of Robert Jensen. Her defense was simple. She'd been kidnapped and held hostage from January 21st through January 29th, had participated in nothing voluntarily, had been terrorized into compliance by Charles, who'd threatened to kill her if she didn't cooperate. The prosecution presented evidence suggesting Caril had been a willing participant. Witnesses who'd seen her laughing and appearing relaxed with Charles during the spree. Forensic evidence suggesting she'd helped clean up crime scenes and dispose of evidence. And Charles's testimony, he testified against her, claiming she'd been an active participant, had encouraged some of the killings, had been excited by the violence and the notoriety. The question of Caril's guilt or innocence became a national debate. Some believed she was clearly a victim, a 14-year-old girl manipulated and controlled by an older, violent boyfriend who'd murdered her family and held her captive. Others believed she was a willing participant, a girl who'd romanticized criminal behavior, who'd been flattered by Charles's attention, who'd gone along with murder because she was caught up in the excitement and danger. The jury struggled with this question. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict, but with a recommendation for mercy. On November 21, 1958, Judge Spencer sentenced Caril Ann Fugate to life in prison. She was 15 years old, making her one of the youngest people in American history to receive a life sentence for murder. Charles Starkweather spent 17 months on death row at Nebraska State Penitentiary, filing appeals that were consistently denied, giving interviews where he alternated between defiance and self-pity, reading fan mail from people, mostly teenage girls, who romanticized him as a rebel or misunderstood victim. On June 25, 1959, Charles Starkweather was executed in the electric chair. He was 20 years old. His last words were reportedly, "I'm sorry, but what's done is done. I can't change it now." Whether he meant he was sorry for the murders or sorry for being caught remained unclear. He ate his last meal, cold cuts, potato salad, and a Pepsi, and walked to the electric chair without resistance. The execution was carried out at 12:04 a.m. Charles was pronounced dead at 12:10 a.m. after 2 cycles of 2,000 volts. His body was claimed by his family, cremated, and the ashes scattered in an undisclosed location. No memorial marks his existence. Nebraska law enforcement destroyed most of his personal effects, wanting nothing preserved that could become collectibles or memorial items for people who might romanticize his crimes. Caril Ann Fugate served 18 years in prison. Throughout her incarceration, she maintained her innocence, claimed she'd been a hostage rather than a participant, fought for parole repeatedly. In 1976, after serving 18 years, she was paroled at age 32. She was granted a full pardon by the Nebraska Board of Pardons in 2020 when she was 77 years old. The board concluding that evidence suggested she'd been more victim than perpetrator, that her age at the time, 14, meant she'd been subject to Charles's manipulation and control in ways that adult accomplices wouldn't have been. Caril changed her name after release, married, lived quietly, worked ordinary jobs, and avoided media attention for decades. In occasional interviews, she expressed anger at being portrayed as Charles's willing accomplice, insisted she'd been terrified throughout the 8 days, said that Charles had threatened to kill her the way he'd killed her family if she didn't cooperate. Whether this was true or whether it was a narrative she'd constructed to rationalize her own actions remained debated by those who'd studied the case. The 11 people killed by Charles Starkweather represented a cross-section of 1950s American life. Robert Colvert, 21, working 2 jobs to support his new wife and baby daughter. His widow remarried but reportedly never recovered from the trauma of losing her husband so violently and randomly. The Bartlett family, Marion, Velda, and 2-year-old Betty Jean, whose murders left Caril's surviving relatives devastated, many blaming themselves for not investigating more aggressively when they suspected something was wrong. August Meyer, 70, a farmer who'd shown Charles kindness by occasionally hiring him, murdered as payment for that kindness. Robert Jensen, 17, and Caril King, 16, teenagers whose deaths represented the loss of futures, college, careers, families they'd never have. Caril's family was particularly devastated, her mother dying less than a year later, reportedly from grief. C. Lauer Ward and Clara Ward, successful business owners whose wealth made them targets for someone who resented what they represented. Merle Collison, a traveling shoe salesman who'd stopped to nap in his car and was shot 9 times while he slept. Each death represented not just a life ended, but families destroyed, communities traumatized, and the shattering of 1950s America's illusion that violence was something that happened elsewhere, not in heartland towns like Lincoln or Bennett or Douglas. The Starkweather-Fugate case became a defining moment in how Americans understood violence. This wasn't crime for profit, wasn't mental illness in the traditional sense, wasn't even crime of passion. It was spree killing, random murder driven by rage at the world, by desire for notoriety, by the collapse of psychological barriers that normally prevent people from killing. The case influenced American culture profoundly. It inspired the 1973 film Badlands, directed by Terrence Malick, which romanticized the story, portrayed Charles as a rebel and Caril as tragic figure, and helped establish the lovers on the run trope in American cinema. It influenced Bruce Springsteen's album Nebraska, which included a song about Starkweather. It informed how journalists and law enforcement understood spree killings, establishing the template that would be repeated with later cases like Bonnie and Clyde comparisons. discussions of alienation and poverty as contributing factors, debates about accomplice culpability. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about American society. Charles wasn't a monster who appeared from nowhere. He was a working-class kid from Nebraska who'd been bullied, marginalized, denied opportunities, told implicitly and explicitly that he was worth nothing. That doesn't excuse his murders. Millions of people experience poverty and bullying without becoming killers. But it did force recognition that alienation and rage were building in 1950s America beneath the surface prosperity, that not everyone benefited from the economic boom, and that those left behind sometimes exploded in violence that seemed random but reflected deeper social problems. The question of Caril's guilt or innocence remained controversial for decades. Was she Charles's victim, kidnapped and terrorized into compliance? Or was she his willing accomplice, a teenage girl drawn to danger and violence? The truth was probably somewhere between those extremes. She was young enough to be manipulated, but old enough to make choices, caught between love and terror in ways that 14-year-olds aren't equipped to navigate, and possibly both victim and participant in different moments throughout the 8 days. If this story made you think about alienation and violence in American culture, about the nature of teenage relationships and manipulation, and about how easily murder can become spree killing when psychological barriers collapse, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that explore the dark side of American history. Comment below, at what age are people fully responsible for participating in murders? How much does poverty and social marginalization contribute to violence? And where's the line between explanation and excuse? Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always obvious or foreign. Sometimes they're teenagers from working-class neighborhoods who've been told their entire lives they're worthless, who've found one person who accepts them, who decide that if the world won't give them respect, they'll take it through violence. Charles Starkweather killed 11 people because he was angry at a world that had given him nothing, and 11 families paid for that anger with the lives of people they loved. The teenage rebel became a mass murderer, and America learned that violence doesn't always come from obviously broken people in obviously broken places. Sometimes it comes from ordinary kids in ordinary towns who snap in ways nobody predicted until it was too late and the bodies were already piling up across Nebraska and Wyoming.